There's no denying that the past decade or so has been humiliating for the United States. The failures seem to be coming at an accelerating rate. The 2008 financial crisis made US government and business look like a pack of greedy fools, while our regime change agenda slaughtered 1 million people in Iraq and Syria. Just as we seemed to be emerging from those fiascos, the election of a clown president made us look ridiculous, and then a pandemic that should have been easy to deal with highlighted how weak all of our institutions had become, from our infantile television news to our over-privatized and nearly useless medical establishment. And over the past year, we have seen quick-fire calamities on the military frontiers in Afghanistan and Ukraine. It's easy to see all this and assume that US empire has reached the end of its time on top. But that's not what I see. I see an opportunity. I believe that the US world system could emerge from this period with a less imperial edge and better position to serve its own people and benefit the world. What this era could end up giving us is the gift of prioritization. Realizing that we can't do everything could give us the ability to do many things much, much better. We've seen it happen before. I'm a student of the British Empire, and I find that multiple scenes from its development are useful for understanding the United States. I worry about the US experiencing a Suez crisis, the final humiliation of an empire's aspirations to independent action, like the one the British experienced in Egypt in 1956. I'm not alone in seeing US victory over the Soviet Union in the early 1990s as similar to British victory over France in 1815, launching a period of unquestioned supremacy. But today I want to talk about an even earlier period and the striking parallels I see to Biden's America. I'm talking, of course, about the War of American Independence. As a US citizen, I like to see the United States and its founding heroes as the main players in that drama. Some of the documents we wrote during that time ended up being very important, but in truth, Washington, Jefferson, and the rest were merely bit players in a wider world drama. What happened in the 1760s and the 1770s was that the British had gotten a little too full of themselves. You see, the problem was that they had won a war. That can be a problem for a country more often than you'd think. And the war that the British had won was the biggest war in human history up to that point. We call it the French and Indian War in the United States, but it's more widely known as the 7 Years' War. It was a titanic struggle that many believe is the first that truly deserves the title of a world war. Between 1756 and 1763, the British and their allies won a series of battles across the world, creating the first global system of empire. These 7 years saw the beginning of Britain's territorial empire in India, the conquest of most of French North America, the humiliation of the Spanish Empire, and the destruction of yet another French navy, all enabled by an incredibly bloody stalemate on the European continent. After a series of miraculous years, the British looked out on a world that they began to think of as their own, to do with as they wished. And in that arrogance, they made a crucial mistake. They forgot their allies. In their rush to swallow France's overseas possessions, Britain made a separate peace with France, abandoning their ally Prussia, the country that eventually unified Germany, to figure things out for itself. Prussia had lost vastly more soldiers than the British and got absolutely no benefit from the war. The British of the 1760s began to mistake a clever system of government and finance and a series of very lucky breaks for a predestined, God-ordained inability to fail. They seemed to think that they could effortlessly control the whole world for all time. A lot like my country in the 1990s, in fact. By this point, the parallels should be obvious. After the end of the Cold War, the US got cocky. We assumed we could control everything, everywhere, all the time. We started picking fights with people, not based on our interests, but based on our idea of how people should run their own countries. Our IMF, WTO, UAV combo has inspired vastly more tea parties than any 18th century British Stamp Act. This imperial nonsense has led to humiliation after humiliation for the United States. So what should we do about this? Well, let's look at what the British did. Fighting broke out in North America in 1775 and proved to be frustrating for the British. They could win big victories, but Washington and his insurgents would just retreat into the woods and keep on fighting. Things got really bad in 1778 when the French jumped in on the American side. Unlike almost every other conflict between France and Britain, London found itself without allies on the continent. Prussia sat this one out, and the Dutch even joined in against the British for the first time in almost a century. The British faced the horrifying prospect of a France that was free to put the majority of its resources towards a navy and threaten not just the North American colonies, but the rest of Britain's overseas empire as well. Britain's insistence on being everywhere and winning everything had now put the whole system in jeopardy. So the British prioritized. The slave colonies they ran in the Caribbean were much more lucrative, so that's where they put their military focus, battling back the French and Spanish there. They gave up North America and the Mediterranean island of Minorca, but by focusing on the competitions that actually mattered, they set themselves up for the next century. And they set themselves up incredibly well. Losing North America wasn't the end of the British world system, it was the beginning. Prioritization made them more powerful, not less. In the 1780s, the United States achieved its independence in political terms, but it would be more than a century before we got anything like real economic independence. In the first two-thirds of the 1800s, the British got to pretend to be against slavery while financing it and profiting massively. Continuing financial empire in the United States gave Britain the resources it needed to build territorial and informal empire everywhere else. The British Empire in the 1860s reached peaks that would have dazzled the imperialists that lost the United States. The past 2 decades have seen the United States making many Britain in the 1760s style screw-ups. We are, of course, vastly more powerful than they were. We rarely need to use military force to coerce and destroy countries. With a world financial system mostly based on computers in New York and a few teams of lawyers in Washington, D.C., we have shut down the economies of Venezuela, Syria, Iran, and North Korea. We occasionally send out the U.S. Navy to hijack some Iranian ships, but those bits of old-fashioned piracy are really just icing on the cake. The sun never sets on our empire of economic coercion. Washington, D.C. isn't content to hold the world in thrall with lawyers, though. Our entire government is now organized around the corruption around selling weapons. So we've spent the past 2 decades creating progressively more elaborate and ridiculous situations in which we can use those weapons. In the first decade of this century, we partnered with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to fight terrorists that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia had created and continued to fund and support while we were fighting them. A little negotiation with Afghanistan in 2001 would probably have quickly given us Osama bin Laden, but our politicians preferred to keep up the weapons sale churn for a decade, working with Saudi Arabia to spread the ideology of terror to places like Syria before finally carrying out a hit on bin Laden in his Pakistani refuge. In Syria, we partnered with Turkey and Saudi Arabia to open up space in northern Syria for jihadists fighting the Assad government, and then pivoted to fighting one of our proxies there when it got out of hand. Hilariously, both Republicans and Democrats love to celebrate our victory over that proxy, the Islamic State, as a big success. Oh yeah, and we only beat the Islamic State by partnering with groups that Turkey sees as terrorists. So to defeat the Islamic State, we endangered our relationship with a top 20 economy and NATO's second biggest military. And we did this to defeat a group that was largely created by the CIA and our Saudi allies. Big success! It's important to remember that these lucrative but fundamentally idiotic conflicts in the Middle East are really just a sideshow. There are other nuclear powers in the world with real militaries, and our policy towards them has also been as aggressive as humanly possible. When I was born in the 1970s, we were contending with these countries over places like Vietnam and Germany. Now we are winning a dispute with China over a territory that mostly speaks Mandarin Chinese, and we are humiliating Russia in a proxy war in a country where most people still speak Russian. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I like Ukraine and Taiwan too. I just think it's important to recognize how aggressively and successfully we've been kicking the crap out of Russia and China for like 30 years now. In the 1780s, British overstretch meant that they lost the territory that became the United States. The problem we have now is not any serious threat from another power, but the damage that irresponsibly aggressive US policies have done to our world system. We won't lose any territory, but our policies have pushed the world to the breaking point. This has implications everywhere, but can be seen most clearly in the price of oil. We're trying to move away from dependence on oil and gas, but we are simply not there yet. Over the past decade, US foreign policy has destroyed the oil industries of Iran and Venezuela, as well as Iraq and Libya for significant periods as well. Now Russia's savage invasion of Ukraine has provided the straw that has broken the camel's back. Well, actually it's more a ton of bricks than a straw. Last week, the price of a barrel of oil shot over $100 for the first time in 8 years. This week, it should hit $150. Will it hit $200 a barrel next week? And keep in mind that oil is just the most obvious factor. Isolating Russia economically is going to break everything. Food prices, inflation everywhere else, financial markets, everything. The United States needs to get out ahead of this disaster by taking a step back. The old maximum problems with everyone policy just isn't going to cut it anymore. We aren't going to back off China or Russia at all, nor should we. I hate to admit it, but it appears the US warmongers were exactly right about Putin's aggressiveness. I'm pretty sure US warmongers created the Putin problem, but it's a problem nonetheless. Russia has already lost its war in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean it won't go on for months or years to come. China seems to be backing Russia's play, and its childish behavior during the Trump administration has convinced me they aren't a responsible actor either. And while Russia certainly looks a lot less intimidating over the past couple weeks, China and Russia remain our only two real competitors, and it's in our national interest to continue confronting them. All the rest of the nonsense needs to end. Middle East playtime needs to be over. We have a real fight now. We don't need the made-up ones anymore. It's time to get the weapons salesmen out and send the diplomats in. We need to let Iran, Syria, and Yemen back into the world community and talk about reconstruction contracts instead of missile contracts. Venezuela and Cuba need to be welcomed back now too. We are in a much more serious conflict with Russia now, and no matter how important it is for Florida politics, we just can't afford to hold on to these grudges in our own hemisphere. Iran and Venezuela's oil industries will take some time to get going again, but once they do, they will be an important part of dealing with higher prices. Giving up on all these silly little fights with little countries isn't just the right thing to do morally and financially speaking, it's also the best way to shut down Russia diplomatically. None of these countries have any treaty obligations to Russia. They were just driven into Russia's arms by our insane aggression. If we try a little honey, I think things will improve dramatically. It worked for FDR in Latin America, but I guess that's a different video. To its credit, the Biden administration has already entered into talks with both Venezuela and Iran. We need these processes to go more quickly, and we need to shut down the remaining warhawks in DC who are getting in the way. It's important to recognize that in the current price environment, US sanctions on Iran don't work anyway. They're just giving China and Iran a discount on the black market. Why not get back into the Iran nuclear deal so we can get the benefit of Iranian oil and also get some limits on their nuclear program? The US world system is at a transition point. Competition with Russia and China is heating up. What we need to do now is prioritize and let go of all these stupid little fights that Washington, D.C. loves so much. If we can do that and learn from the British Empire, then the US world system's best days are still ahead of us. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and you can buy my book, Avoiding the British Empire, at this link in either paperback or Amazon Kindle form. Thanks.